everyone, welcome back to the second Glen Ira online sewing tutorial. My name is Jennifer Anderson from Soul Stitcher Sewing Classes, and I'm going to run through with you today how to make the little purse here. Last week, if you took part in the session, you would have made the little pot. This is still online, so you can still access the tutorial if you haven't done it, so go ahead and do that. The technique that we're going to use today to make this little purse is similar in some of the processes to the techniques that you would have used to make the pot. We're going to make this little purse today, and to make this little purse we are going to need some fabrics. Now, because we are currently in stage 4 lockdowns, some of you may have some difficulty accessing fabrics. So I'm just going to have a little chat with you about what types of fabrics we can use. You could, if you don't have anything at your disposal, possibly buy online or over the phone from Darn Sheet Fabrics in Glen Huntly Road. I do believe that they have contactless pickup for people who live within 5 kilometres of the store. So it might be worth giving them a call, especially because for this project we're going to need a zip. So if you don't have a zip in your little box of sewing bits and pieces, you will need to get one. Regarding fabrics, you can use, we only need a fairly small piece of fabric, so when you're at the supermarket next, you could, for example, just grab a couple of tea towels. That would be absolutely fine. If you have any half decent old tea towels that are okay, could just do with maybe a good wash. This one's pretty cool. Would make a gorgeous little purse. The other thing that you could use is pillowcases. Now this one is a slightly quilted pillowcase. It's got a little bit of padding. If you're confident to work with something that thickness, you could use something like that. Or you could use a shirt. I have this shirt here that I have used for a few projects, and one of which is was cutting out a lining for my sample that I'm going to show you today. So that is a perfect piece of fabric to use as your lining. Probably not so suitable for your outside. For the outside part of your little purse, you need something that is a little bit more durable, like a drill or a canvas. This fabric here is actually a linen that I got from IKEA, which you can't go to at the moment. And this is also, coincidentally, an IKEA fabric as well. Okay, so there's a list of materials and requirements that you will need for this project. I'm going to put a list of them up on the screen if you haven't seen them already, and you can pause the video, go and get everything that you need, and then we'll get started. Okay, so now we're going to make our pattern. So for this step, you're going to need your paper, you'll need a pen and a pencil, your ruler, and your scissors. If you're going to use a cutting mat and a ruler and a blade, then you'll need those. When we have finished our pattern, this is what it's going to look like. So let's get cutting out our pattern. Okay, so to have a pattern that is going to finish up looking like this, we are going to start by folding our A4 sheet in half. If you did the pot tutorial last week, we are going to fold it the other way. So it's going to fold this way. So this is what we're going to end up with. And what we are going to do is in the bottom corner of our folded piece of paper, we are going to cut out a square, similar to what we did last week. We are going to measure in from the open edge here, 4.5 centimeters. So 4.5 centimeters in, and we are going to measure up 3.5 centimeters. You will need to measure and make sure that that is really nice and square at a right angle here. Once we've done that, we are then going to either use our scissors or our blade, and we are going to cut that corner out, turn it around, and cut along there. And then when you open it up, we have the same as what we have here. And we are going to, using our pen, draw a line down that, exactly down that folded line there. And we are going to label that straight grain. And then on the bottom here, we are going to write place on fold. So I'll just turn that around to do that. Place on fold. If you made the pot last week, you will, it's the same process. We're going to put that on the fold of our fabric. Now on this purse, we have got 1 centimetre seams all the way around. So we've got a 1 centimetre seam here. We've got a 1 centimetre seam on this side and 1 centimetre also on the top where we're going to be putting our zip. The same on this side. It's really important to label your patterns with the seam allowances because if you come back to do this at another time, you need to know what your seam allowances are. 1 centimetre seam allowance is a good seam allowance because it's easy to work with, it's not too small, and it's also not too big. Okay, so that is what we end up with. That's our pattern to make our purse. Now that we have finished cutting our pattern, we are going to cut out our fabric. When we have finished our fabric, cutting out our fabric, this is what it's going to look like. So this is the lining, and this piece here, which is my IKEA linen fabric, is for the outside. Just remind you that that is my old shirt that I cut up. Very attractive. So that's what we're going to end up with when we finish cutting our 2 pieces of fabric. Alright, for the next step we are going to need our scissors, 2 pieces of fabric that we're going to use, and obviously your pattern. If you are using the cutting mat and the blade and the ruler, you will need that as well. You could use a tape measure. I'm going to use my ruler to measure my straight grains. You will also need a piece of chalk, dressmaker's chalk, or you can use, as we discussed last week, some little soap remnants. If you don't have either of those, you could use a pencil. Obviously a pencil wouldn't show up on this fabric. It depends what colour fabric you'll be using. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is fold our fabric in half. Now you want to have your right sides on the inside. This fabric here obviously doesn't have a right and a wrong side, so we are all good. We are going to put our pattern onto our fabric with the place on fold edge on the fold of your fabric, making sure that it's all really nice and straight. And I'm just going to line that up there. And then we are going to measure from the top of our straight grain across here to our nice edge of our fabric. And I've got 16.5 there, and then I have 17 there, so I'm just going to straighten that up a little bit. Okay, so 17 and 17, perfect. Okay, I'm going to use my cutting mat and my blade and my ruler to cut this one out, and then for this one here I will use the pins and the scissors. So that one down there. Try not to move your pattern around too much if you're using the blade and the cutting mat. What you can do instead is actually just move your cutting mat around, making sure it's still nicely placed on the fold there, always cutting away from you. And then with our corners here, we're going to cut into there. It's a little bit tricky doing this upside down. and into there. And I will need to give this a little snip here just to break that last little bit off. And this one here. All right. Now what we're going to do here is use our chalk or our soap, whatever you've got on hand, and we are going to mark the bottom of our fold here on both sides. Just going to neaten this bit up around the right way. Okay, so that is one piece, and then we're going to do the same with the other piece. So folding it in half. You can see we have a nice selvage on this piece here. And I'm going to lay that nice and flat, get our nice folded edge there. Make sure our selvages are all lined up nicely. We're going to place our pattern right on the fold. And then we're going to pin. So to pin this one, I always recommend to pin your two edges on the fold there. Then we're going to pin the two top corners. When you're pinning something onto a piece of fabric, never work in a clockwise or anti-clockwise direction. You always pin your corners and then fill in the edges. Depends how good at cutting you are. I always recommend popping a few pins in so that you're not so that you're cutting nice and straight. Using your scissors, leave your pattern in your paper flat on the surface that you're working on, preferably not the dining table, and just cut around the edge here. Just use my little snippers to cut the corners there. Once again, the same thing with our chalk or whatever you're using to mark your corners, your folded edge, sorry. We mark our folded edge, take the pins out, pop them on the pin magnet, pop the pattern aside, and there we are. We have our two pieces of fabric that we need to make our purse. Okay, so let's get going with sewing. Okay, so the first thing we are going to do to start constructing our little purse is to put our zip on the top edge. Now with your zip, you'll probably have a zip that possibly comes with a tag on it like this. When you remove that, just make sure also that you remove the staple as well out of the end here. So with your zip, the side with the little toggle on it here is the right side. I'm going to refer to the right side of your zip and the wrong side of your zip. So you always have to make sure that you have the right side of your zip on the right side of your fabric. Now, as I said before, this fabric here doesn't really have a right and a wrong side, but we're going to pin our zip onto the right side of our zip onto the right side of our fabric. Now it's really important to make sure, and if you need a ruler or a tape measure to measure, you need to place your little metal lug here about 1.5 centimeters in from the edge. So if you can see here, I'm placing, and it's usually about the length of this little tail here, but sometimes they are shorter and sometimes they are longer. So we're going to put the metal lug about 1.5 centimeters in from our edge, and we are going to pin. Now when you're pinning across here, I want you to make sure that you can see maybe 5 millimeters of your fabric sticking out over the top here. Okay, so we're just going to pin this down here, pop a couple of pins in, and when we get to the end here, I usually put a pin down the bottom here as well, just to hold it in place so that when you pull that last pin out, it doesn't move around. It's exactly the same as sewing 2 bits of fabric together. So when we're sewing with our zip, you really need to use a zipper foot. Now this is your zipper foot here. Some different machines have ones that look slightly different. This one here is off an industrial machine, but it will look something like this. You can have a look up in your instruction book for your sewing machine, and it should have in there a foot that looks very similar to this, and it should be called a zipper foot. So to put your change your foot on your sewing machine, you should have a button on the back here or a lever that you press, which releases your regular foot, and then you are going to put your zipper foot on, and you are going to put it on so that your needle comes down on the left hand side of this little nose sticking out the front. So you want to have it on the left hand side. Now it is really, really important to always do one rotation of your needle by hand. So using your dial on the right side of your machine, turn it around and make absolutely sure that you are not going to, that your needle is not going to crash into your foot and break your needle. Okay, I'm just adding this small section in because I realize that at this time with isolation, it's going to be tricky for some people to get zips. So I'm just, this is the technique that I'm going to be teaching today, where we have our stopper at the end here, and we have the this end of our zip extending over the edge. Some of you may in fact have a zip that is exactly the right length if you've perhaps pulled it out of an old garment or something. If that's the case, you are going to need to stitch your zip. So you'll need to pin your zip so that it's exactly 1.5 centimeters in from the end here and 1.5 centimeters in from this edge. When you're stitching, you're going to need to put your zipper foot down, rotate your dial so that your needle is actually in to your fabric. Make sure you do have your needle in. You start off with a reverse stitch, and then you are going to stitch halfway along your zip, lift up your zipper foot, open your zip. Sometimes you may need to lift your zipper foot that little bit further in order to get your zipper head past. Make sure you put your zipper foot back down once you have opened your zip. Make sure when you get to the end here that your zip stays nice and straight on your fabric and doesn't try and move down this way. And then you're going to finish up with a reverse stitch or a lock stitch. Take your needle out, lift your skis up, and there you have it. If in fact you are using a zip that you have reclaimed from a, my suggestion would be take one off anything. Sometimes you get linen that comes in bags that has zips on it, so you might be able to unpick a zip from one of those bags. You could use perhaps a bag that is a suit bag. You can get a zip out of the center of the zip, the center of the suit bag. Now, if you're going to be doing it that way, What I would suggest is that you stitch your end here, because it won't have a metal stopper on it. Either stitch your end here just with a little row of stitching, or you can even use a stapler and just staple the end, just so that your zipper head doesn't come off the end there, because it probably will. If you're doing this technique, all you have to do is put your zip onto your fabric, just have it so that it's centered, and you'll just continue in the same technique as I am going to demonstrate with the regular zipper that has the metal stopper on the end. You'll just stitch all the way across there, and then you'll fold it over. So once we've sorted that out, we are going to start sewing. Now, as I said, it's exactly the same as sewing two pieces of fabric together. You're just going to start off with a reverse stitch at the beginning, and you're going to end with a reverse stitch at the end. I am obviously stitching in not matching thread again, because I want you to be able to see where I'm stitching. So off we go. Pull your pins out as you go, and we're stitching nice and straight down the center of your zipper tape. If you have your zipper tape lined up correctly, you should be stitching about 1 centimeter from this raw edge here. And when we get to the end, we just do a reverse stitch. You don't need to go all the way to the end of your zip, just to the end of where your fabric is. We're going to chop that off there afterwards. Okay. We can take that pin out. So as you can see, we've stitched straight down the center of our zipper tape there, and that's going to fold over, and that's going to be all nice and neat on the other side. Okay, so now that we have our zip stitched to the right side of our the top of our purse, we're now going to put our lining onto this. So to do that, we need to put the right side of our lining onto the right side of our fabric like this, so that we are sandwiching the zip in the middle there. And we are going to turn it over, just because it makes it a lot easier to just sew straight over the line of stitching that we just sewed. So we're going to once again pin that across the top, and this time we're going to be making sure that our raw edges at the top are lined up really nicely. So the cut edge of our lining and the cut edge of our main fabric are lined up at the top. We also need to make sure that they are lined up down the side here as well. So you want to have them lined up on the edges. And then we are going to sew. Once again, we're going to do a reverse stitch at the beginning and a reverse stitch at the end, and you're going to sew straight over the top of the row of stitching you've just done. Cut all your threads off, and what you should have now is your zip sandwiched in between your lining and the right side of your fabric. So now what we're going to do is put the zip onto the other side. So we're going to do exactly the same thing that we just did then, but we are going to do it on the other side. So we're going to place our zip onto the right side of our fabric here, making sure that our edges are nicely lined up, and we're going to pin it Once again, leaving that couple of millimeters of fabric at the top. Okay, so we are going to sew straight across here, reverse stitch at the beginning, reverse stitch at the end. Okay, so once we have done that, we are going to bring our lining up. Now this is a little bit confusing. We're going to bring our lining up right side to right side, but we're going to bring it right up to here. So we're going to do the same as what we did before. We're going to sew straight across the top again. So I'm just going to pin that, and then I'm going to show you what it actually looks like. Okay, so I've pinned that on there. Now, a couple of key things to note. Once again, you need to make sure that your edges are really lined up nicely. And what we've actually got here is, this is our lining, and this is the main part of our fabric, and the zip is sandwiched in the middle. Okay, this is our little metal lug that we've got at this point here. And we're going to sew straight over the top of that row of stitching that we have just done. Okay, so now we have our zip in place, and we're going to take our purse over and give it a little press now. So I've opened the zip, and we're going to take it over to the ironing board and give it a little press. Okay, so we're going to give it a really good press now, which is going to make it sit really nice and flat. So we are going to open our zip to start off with, and then we're going to use either our pressing ham, or if you don't have a pressing ham, you can use a rolled up towel. And the first thing we're going to do is put our ham or our towel into here like this, and we are going to press so that we get a really nice flat edge on our zipper edge here. And then once you've done that, you fold your lining in and you put it nice and flat on the ironing board. And my iron there. And then you do the same thing to the other side. You can see how much of a difference the pressing makes. This is linen, so it's beautiful and presses really nicely. But you can see how much of a difference pressing makes to the way it sits. This one here is not pressed, and this one here is pressed, and it makes it sit really nicely. So we do the same thing on this side. Then what I usually say is if you do your zip up and put your ham or your towel in the end here and just give that a nice little press on the end there as well. Now you can see how that makes it sit really nice and flat compared to what it was before. So we've got our zip here, and when we open our zip up, we have that all on the inside. If you've squished it all, wrinkled your fabric at all while you've been pressing, just make sure that it's all nice and flat before we start the next step. Okay, do not chop this part of the zip off yet. So next we move on to sewing our side seams. Okay, so what we are going to do now is stitch the side seams together. So we've opened our zip, just leave it you know, a couple of inches closed there. We're going to turn it inside out, and we're going to have it so that it sits right side to right side. So you've got the right side of your fabric facing the right side of your fabric, and we're actually going to sew down the side seams here. And then we're going to box our corners, which is what we did last week when we made the little pot. The difference here is that we are sewing with our zip in it. Now it's really important when you're pinning this to make sure that your zipper teeth go towards your lining. So you want to fold it this way. So your teeth are going towards the lining and your seam goes towards the main part of your fabric. And then what we're going to do, and I'm just going to pin it over this way, it's just only because we are going to be stitching from this point here down the bottom here, and so the seam is just going in the flow of the way that we're sewing. It just makes it a little bit easier. So the first thing we're going to do is put a pin in here where our zip is, just to make sure that it stays lined up nicely. Now you can put your pin in this way if you want to, and then we're just going to put a pin down the bottom here, another pin in there, and then we're going to stitch. So we're stitching all the way through from this side here all the way to this side. Now we have to remember that we have to be very careful of our little metal lug on the end of our zip, which is right in here. Now if you remember when we were making the pattern, we were making it with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So we are stitching down here 1 centimeter from our cut edge. This is quite a way away from where our metal lug is, which is right there. Now if you want to, you can get your dressmaker's chalk and do a little mark there, just to remind you of it, make sure you're aware of it. You could put a pin in that has a different color, just so that you remember that there is a something you've got to be aware of. Okay, so we're going to stitch all the way down there. Before we do that, actually, we are going to change our foot, because we no longer need our zipper foot. So we're going to take that off by pressing the little button on the back. We're going to put that aside, and we're going to put our regular foot back on, putting it down. Okay, and now we are going to stitch our 1 centimeter seam allowance all the way down there. Reverse stitch, target stitch at the beginning and the end of your seam. Remember, as you come up to where your zip is, you've got to be careful of your metal lug. You can put your hand at the back of your fabric here, and you're not pulling or or you're just really holding it nice and taut so that it's going to go over the top of your zip nice and smoothly all the way down to the bottom. So there you go. We've got our seam going all the way from one end down to the other end. All right, so now we've stitched this side, so we're going to stitch the next side. This side's a little bit easier because we don't have our metal lug on the end of our zip. So we're just going to make sure that these match up really well. We're still matching up our cut edges here really nicely, making sure that our zip goes towards the lining and that the seams are going towards the main part of our purse. Okay, so I'm going to put a pin in there to hold that nice and flat. Put a couple of pins in here. Now, if you made the fabric pot, you will remember that we had to leave an opening in our lining seam in order to be able to turn it through. So you can stitch up from the bottom about 5 centimeters. Doesn't really matter how far it is. We just need to be able to leave an opening in here so that we can get our fingers in and turn it through. Now, I would suggest possibly leaving an opening of about 7 centimeters, and this will be, about 7 centimeters. So we're going to start with a reverse stitch here, reverse stitch there. Then we're going to start again, leaving this bit unstitched. We're going to stitch from there all the way down to the end. So off we go. Make sure with your fingers that your zip is sitting nice and flat, because at this end it was connected, this end it isn't. So you want it to be sitting really nice and flat. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of a bump if your needle hits the nylon teeth of your zip. All the way down to the bottom and a reverse stitch. Chop off your threads. Okay, and we still have this little tail. We'll chop that off later. Now we're going to box our corners, and obviously we've got 4 corners we need to box here. We're going to start off with our main fabric. Now, last week when we did the pot, we split our seams open. We're not going to do that with this because we've got our zip and it just doesn't sit very nicely. So we're actually going to push our seam to one side. And you can see here, the same as what we did last week, we are going to match up our little mark that we did here, which when we cut our fabric out, this was our folded edge, and you should have marked with your chalk or your pencil a little mark on the end there. Now when you pull this like this, you are going to match your little mark up with your seam line, and it should match exactly, and they should sit really nice and flat. We're going to pin that. 1 pin should be sufficient. And this is the really important thing here, is that we stitch exactly from here all the way to the end here. It's a little bit trickier making the purse as to making the pot, because you can't really lay it flat like what we did when we were making the pot. And this one here, we are going to put our pin in there like that. So we're going to stitch the same all the way across. I'm going to pin them all now while I'm here. We've got our lining, we're doing the same. Now, when we're doing this side, you need to make sure that your seam goes the same way as it did on the outside. You don't want it to be twisted, okay? So you need to make sure that whatever way it's sitting on the outside of your fabric, it sits the same on the lining. So you can see that's on both sides, it's going the same way. And then on this side, we're going to do the same thing. Make sure that it sits that way. Okay, so now that I have pinned all four sides, all four corners, I am going to stitch them. I'm going to do a reverse stitch at the beginning and a reverse stitch at the end. It's quite important that you get this sitting really nice and flat, because otherwise the base of your purse will be a bit wonky if you don't get this nice and even. Once again, a 1 centimeter seam, so we're stitching all the way down here. Reverse stitch at the beginning and the end. Okay, so as you can see, we've stitched all the way from one end to the other end on all four corners. So we have something that looks a bit like this. Okay, so now we're going to chop off the excess of our zip here. If you don't have a really sharp pair of scissors, you can do this in 2 separate bits. So cutting one like that, and the other like that. Okay, and then we've got our little hole here that we left in one side of our lining. So we're going to put our hand in here, and because we've left our zip open, we can get our hands in and we can pull, pull that through. I've got white stitching on mine, so you can see the little white stitching lines, but if you've used matching thread, you won't be able to see that. Poked out the corners of the base there, and then we have our, where's our opening here? So we've got our opening. It's a good idea to give this a little press to make it sit really nice and flat. Once again, with your opening here, we can see our opening is about 7 centimeters long. So what we want to do is we want to start about 1 centimeter before the opening and finish about 1 centimeter after the opening. So your stitching line is going to be about 9 centimeters. And once again, as when we made the pot, it's going to be about 2 millimeters from the edge. So really nice and close. Pop a couple of pins in just to make sure that you get it, making sure you get both sides of the fabric. And you start with a reverse stitch and end with a reverse stitch. Okay, you can see that we've stitched that just a couple of millimeters from the edge, and that just closes that opening. Like I said, if you have trouble doing that, it's a good idea to give it a little press so that you get that really nice knife edge to sew there. Okay, so we should put the lining inside, give it a little press, and we are done. Okay, so now that we are done here, we're going to put our fingers into the end here and pop that little end out there. So you've got that, which is a really nice sort of professional feature to have that on there like that. We're going to tuck this in. This is, I've used a nice linen here, so it's very sort of organic looking. Put your iron, open the zip right up and put your iron in and give it a really good press. Just a matter of poking in there and giving your side seams a nice press. You can use your towel or your pressing ham again to get that to sit really nicely. We're just going to give this a little press here. Poke the nose of the iron right up into the zip there. And this one here. Best off pressing with the iron inside your purse. Poke out the corners. Be mindful of the type of fabric that you're using and the heat that you're applying to it. Okay. And there we have it. Okay, so there we have it, all done. I hope yours looks like this. Now, I've got a selection of other ones that I've made here. This one here has a little tassel that I got. This one I'm pretty sure came from Darn Cheap Fabric, so you can, I'm not sure what they have online available, but they have a pretty awesome selection of just little bits and bobs that you can add to things. This one here has a felt pom-pom that I made. And this one here has, because I don't throw anything out, an old piece of a bangle that fell off one day. So raid your single earrings and things like that you can add. This one that I have just made now, I am going to add this little sailor's thing to. There we go. I hope you've enjoyed today's tutorial. And that yours looks something like this. I'm just going to give you a little hint now with your pattern. If in fact your fabric is not very big, or you actually want to make one a little bit smaller, you can fold your pattern and just fold a piece out of the middle of it. Just make sure it's nice and even, and then of course you're going to have a smaller little purse. I am looking forward to seeing you all again next week, where we are going to make this bag, which is a very similar construction to the pot that we made last week, the purse that we've made this week, in that it has the base at the bottom, it has a feature panel on the front, and then we have a recycled, this one's a plaited belt, or you could use a canvas belt as the strap. So looking forward to seeing you again next week. Bye for now.